Whispers echoed through the wooden pews of the Red Oak Church as the massive, wild-eyed trapper stood beside the town's heaviest, most ridiculed spinster. Judge Caldwell smiled, entirely certain this cruel joke of a wedding would break them both by winter. He was wrong. What started as a forced union, meant to steal a family fortune, birthed a reckoning that would burn the corrupt town council to the ground. This is the true account of Martha and Jedediah. Red Oak, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1882, was a town built on mud, gold dust, and vicious gossip. It was a place where a man's worth was measured in cattle and a woman's in her waistline and dowry. Down from the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains came Jedediah McGraw. Standing 6'4", draped in the heavy, unwashed hides of grizzly and elk, Jedediah was a man of the high country. He spoke little, trusted no one, and only ventured into the suffocating confines of civilization twice a year to trade his pelts for coffee, flour, and ammunition. But this particular October, the town had a trap waiting for him. Before Jedediah could even tether his mule at the mercantile, Sheriff Dooley and 3 armed deputies surrounded him. They didn't ask questions. They leveled their Winchesters, stripped him of his hunting knife and Henry rifle, and dragged him into the stifling, cigar-smoke-filled office of Judge Hiram Caldwell. "Take a seat, Mr. McGraw," Judge Caldwell said, not looking up from his mahogany desk. He was a small, rat-faced man whose authority in Red Oak was absolute and thoroughly bought. Jedediah remained standing, his broad shoulders practically filling the width of the small room. "State your business, Caldwell. I have miles to cover before the first snow." "You won't be covering any miles, McGraw," Sheriff Dooley sneered, jabbing the barrel of his rifle into the trapper's ribs. "Not unless it's the short drop from the gallows. We found your traps on railroad property. You've been poaching on land owned by the Union Pacific. That's a federal offense. A hanging offense." Jedediah's jaw tightened beneath his thick, unruly beard. "That land is open territory. The railroad hasn't laid a track within 50 miles of Bitter Creek." "The deed says otherwise," Caldwell replied smoothly, finally leaning back in his leather chair. "I could have you swinging by sunrise. However, I am a merciful man, and I have a proposition that could erase this unfortunate misunderstanding entirely." The judge pulled a heavily sealed document from his drawer. "You are aware of the Higgins family?" Jedediah scowled. Everyone knew the Higgins name. Josiah Higgins had owned the largest cattle operation in the county, controlling the vital waterways that fed the lower ranches. But Josiah had passed away 3 weeks prior, leaving behind a massive estate and a single heir, his 32-year-old daughter Martha. Martha Higgins was the favorite subject of Red Oak's cruelest whispers. In an era where delicate corseted women were prized, Martha was an anomaly. She weighed well over 250 pounds. She was soft-spoken but considered firmly on the shelf, an old maid whose sheer physical size and lack of conventional beauty made her the target of endless, ruthless mockery from the townsfolk. "Josiah's will has a peculiar stipulation," Caldwell explained, tapping the paper. "Martha inherits the ranch and the water rights, but only if she is married. If she remains a spinster by the end of this month, the entirety of the estate defaults to her cousin, Thaddeus Higgins." The name left a foul taste in Jedediah's mouth. Thaddeus was a drunken, gambling brute who had heavily indebted himself to Judge Caldwell. "Thaddeus needs that land," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But Martha is stubborn. She refuses to sign the deed over. So we need to fulfill the terms of the will. We need a husband for her." "Find one," Jedediah grunted. "What's it to me?" "No respectable man in this town will touch her," Dooley laughed cruelly. "She's a behemoth. Thaddeus has also made it clear that any local boy who tries to marry her for the money will end up face down in the river." "That's where you come in, mountain man," Caldwell said, a wicked gleam in his eye. "You marry the Higgins woman tomorrow. You sign the registry, making the marriage legal, and then you take her up to that miserable freezing shack of yours in the high country. You take her away from Red Oak, out of our hair, Thaddeus will petition the court, me, for control of the estate since the heiress has abandoned the property to live in the wilderness." Jedediah stared at the men, realizing the sheer cold-blooded cruelty of the plan. They wanted to exile an innocent woman to the harshest environment in the territory, assuming the brutal winter, isolation, and starvation would either kill her or force her to flee back east, nullifying her claim forever. And they were using a fabricated poaching charge to force Jedediah to be their executioner. "You want me to drag a city woman up to the peaks just so you can steal her inheritance?" Jedediah growled, his hands balling into massive fists. "I want you to marry a fat old maid in exchange for your life, McGraw," Caldwell corrected sharply. "You take her or you hang. It's that simple." Across town, in the cavernous, eerily quiet Higgins manor, Martha Higgins sat in her late father's study. She was dressed in mourning black, the heavy fabric doing nothing to hide her large frame. Her hands, surprisingly deft and ink-stained, were folded over the ranch's heavy leather ledger. The door burst open, and her cousin Thaddeus strode in, smelling of cheap whiskey and chewing tobacco. "Pack your bags, cousin," Thaddeus sneered, leaning against the door frame. "You're getting married tomorrow." Martha did not flinch. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and looked at him with calm, intelligent brown eyes. "I told you, Thaddeus, I have no intention of marrying any of your hired thugs." "Oh, he ain't one of my boys. The judge found him. A wild savage from the high peaks. Smells like bear grease and doesn't string two words together. Jedediah McGraw." Thaddeus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You wanted to keep the ranch so bad? Fine. You'll meet the terms of the will. But your new husband is taking you home to his mountain. I give you a week before you freeze to death or he gets sick of looking at all that blubber and throws you off a cliff." Martha looked down at the ledger. She knew the depths of her cousin's depravity, but this was a new low. They were throwing her to a monster, expecting her to break. They expected her to weep, to beg, to sign over the deed right then and there, to save herself from the terrifying mountain man. Instead, Martha slowly closed the ledger. She stood up, her substantial presence commanding the room despite Thaddeus's mocking grin. "What time is the ceremony, Thaddeus?" she asked, her voice steady and chillingly calm. Thaddeus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Noon. Try to find a tent big enough to wear, cousin." When he left, Martha walked to this window, looking up toward the jagged, snow-dusted peaks in the distance. She had been laughed at her entire life. She had been called a monster, a burden, a joke. They thought the mountains would kill her. They thought the trapper would break her. Martha placed a hand on the cold window pane. "Let them think it," she told herself. The following day, the Red Oak Church was packed to the rafters, though not out of love or respect for the bride. The townsfolk had turned out as if attending a traveling circus, eager to witness the humiliation of the obese spinster and the wild mountain man. Jedediah stood at the altar, rigid with barely contained fury. He had been forced to wash at the barber's and don a stiff, ill-fitting suit that Sheriff Dooley had procured from a dead man's estate. The collar choked him, and the stares of the townsfolk burned into his back. He felt like a caged animal. He hated this town. He hated Caldwell. But most of all, he felt a strange, heavy guilt for what he was about to do to the woman walking down the aisle. The church doors opened. A hush fell over the congregation, instantly followed by cruel, poorly stifled titters and whispers. Martha Higgins walked down the aisle alone. The town's dressmaker had blatantly refused to alter a wedding gown for her, claiming she didn't have enough fabric in the entire shop. So, Martha wore her finest Sunday dress, a deep burgundy velvet that was simple, practical, and wholly unsuited for a bride. Jedediah watched her approach. He had expected a weeping, terrified woman, broken by the town's cruelty. Instead, he saw a woman walking with her head held exceptionally high. Her face was flushed, undoubtedly feeling the weight of 100 mocking eyes, but there were no tears. Her chin was set in a firm, defiant line. She didn't look at the laughing women or the snickering men. She looked straight ahead. She looked at him. When she reached the altar, she took her place beside him. She was tall for a woman, her shoulder coming up to his chest and undeniably heavy, but Jedediah noticed something the rest of the town had missed, There was an iron strength in her posture. "Let's get this over with," Judge Caldwell whispered from the pulpit, acting as the officiant. He rushed through the vows, stripping the ceremony of any sanctity. "Do you, Jedediah, take this woman?" Caldwell asked, barely hiding a smirk. "I do," Jedediah rumbled, his deep voice vibrating in the hollow church. "And do you, Martha, take this man?" "I do," she replied clearly, her voice cutting through the ambient whispers of the crowd. "Sign the register," Caldwell demanded. They signed. The ink was barely dry before Thaddeus pushed his way to the front, clapping Jedediah on the shoulder. "Congratulations, mountain man. Better get your bride loaded up. It's a long way up to Bitter Creek, and I'm sure she's already hungry." Laughter erupted in the first few pews. Jedediah's hand dropped to where his hunting knife usually rested, his eyes flashing with a dangerous feral light that made Thaddeus take a quick step back. Jedediah turned to Martha. "My wagon is out front, Mrs. McGraw. Have you got your things?" "A single trunk," Martha said quietly. "It is already loaded." They walked out of the church together, a massive bearded giant and his heavy, silent bride. They climbed onto the buckboard wagon. Jedediah snapped the reins and the draft horses lurched forward, pulling them away from the laughing town of Red Oak and toward the imposing dark silhouette of the Rockies. For the first 2 hours they did not speak. The road transitioned from flat, dusty plains to steep, rocky switchbacks. The temperature began to plummet as they climbed higher into the altitude. The autumn air turned sharp and biting. Jedediah kept stealing glances at the woman beside him. The wooden seat of the wagon was unforgiving, and the road was violently bumpy. Every jolt sent a shudder through the wagon, yet Martha sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She wore no heavy winter coat, only a wool shawl wrapped tightly around her broad shoulders. Her lips were turning pale from the cold, but she uttered not a single complaint. "It's going to get colder," Jedediah said finally, his voice raspy from disuse. He reached behind the seat and pulled up a thick, heavy buffalo robe. He tossed it roughly onto her lap. "Wrap up. I don't need you freezing to death before we reach the timberline." Martha looked at the heavy fur, then at him. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw." "Jedediah, or Jed," he corrected gruffly. "Ain't no misters where we're going." "Jedediah," she repeated. Her voice was surprisingly soft yet rich. "I am aware of why you are doing this. Thaddeus brags loudly when he drinks. I know they threatened your life to get you to take me away." Jedediah narrowed his eyes, keeping his focus on the treacherous road. "If you know that, then you know this ain't a real marriage. I live in a one-room cabin. I hunt, I trap, I survive. I don't have the means or the patience to care for a society woman." "I am not asking you to care for me," Martha said, pulling the buffalo robe tightly around herself. "I only ask that you do not interfere with me." Jedediah scoffed quietly. She had no idea what awaited her. The mountain didn't care about a person's pride. The wind, the snow, and the isolation stripped people down to their marrow. He gave her 3 days before she broke down, begging him to take her back to face her cousin's mercy. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, terrifying shadows across the pine forests, a harsh sleet began to fall. The wagon wheel slipped dangerously close to the edge of a 200-foot ravine. Jedediah cursed, leaping down into the freezing mud to steady the team and push the heavy wooden wheel out of the rut. To his shock, the wagon suddenly lightened on its stuck side. He looked up through the driving sleet. Martha had climbed down from the wagon into ankle-deep freezing mud. She had wedged her shoulder against the rear of the wagon box, her boots planted firmly in the muck. "What are you doing?" Jedediah roared over the wind. "Get back in the wagon!" "You push the wheel. I will push the box," she shouted back, her face wet with sleet, her glasses fogged over. Jedediah didn't have time to argue. The horses were panicking. He put his massive strength against the wheel, and he felt the immense, solid weight of Martha shifting the rear of the wagon. With a violent heave, the wagon lurched out of the mud and back onto the solid stone of the trail. Jedediah stood panting, covered in mud. He looked at Martha. Her fine burgundy velvet dress was ruined, soaked in freezing mud up to her knees. Her shawl was drenched. Yet, she calmly walked to the side of the wagon, scraped the mud from her boots with a rock, and pulled herself back up onto the bench. She looked down at him, shivering but unbroken. "Shall we continue, Jedediah?" For the first time since he had been ambushed in Red Oak, Jedediah McGraw felt a profound sense of respect. He climbed back onto the wagon, took the reins, and drove them deeper into the wilderness. Night had fully descended by the time they reached the clearing. The sleet had turned to a light powdery snow, coating the towering spruce trees in silver. At the edge of the clearing stood Jedediah's cabin. It was exactly what Judge Caldwell had described, a miserable shack. Built of rough-hewn logs, the roof was patched with sod and pitch. There was one small, cloudy window and a heavy timber door. Jedediah unhitched the horses, expecting to hear the sound of Martha weeping in the wagon. The reality of her situation should have crushed her by now. She was a wealthy heiress, accustomed to servants, warm hearths, and soft beds, now exiled to a lightless hovel in the middle of nowhere. He led the horses into the small lean-to attached to the cabin and walked back to the wagon. Martha was already pulling her heavy trunk toward the tailgate. "Leave it, I'll get it," Jedediah grunted, easily hefting the trunk onto his broad shoulder. He kicked the cabin door open. The inside was freezing, colder than the outside air, as the logs held the chill. The floor was packed dirt. In the corner sat a narrow cot covered in animal skins. There was a cast-iron wood stove, a scarred wooden table, and traps hanging from the rafters. The smell of dried blood, wood smoke, and wet dog permeated the tight space. Jedediah set the trunk down and struck a match, lighting a single oil lantern. The dim yellow light illuminated the stark poverty of his existence. He turned to look at Martha, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. Martha stood in the center of the room. She slowly rotated, taking in the dirt floor, the rusted stove, the solitary bed. She looked at her ruined dress heavy with freezing mud. Then she looked at Jedediah. "Where do you keep your firewood?" she asked. Jedediah blinked, caught off guard. "Out back, under the tarp." "And your water?" "Rain barrel off the roof. It'll be frozen solid by morning." Martha nodded. She took off her ruined shawl and draped it over a chair. She rolled up the sleeves of her mud-caked dress, revealing thick, strong arms. "I will start a fire. You see to the horses." Jedediah stood frozen for a moment. He had expected hysterics. He was prepared to ignore a crying woman. He was not prepared for a woman who simply went to work. He left the cabin in a daze to finish with the team. When he returned 20 minutes later, the transformation was startling. A roaring fire was burning in the cast-iron stove, radiating a fierce, wonderful heat. The dirt floor had been vigorously swept with his old pine bough broom. Martha was standing at his small wash basin, scrubbing the mud from her hands and face. On the stove, his small tin coffee pot was already bubbling, and the smell of salted pork and beans, rations he had brought up months ago, filled the room. Jedediah took off his heavy bearskin coat and hung it on a peg. He watched her as she moved around the small space. Despite her immense size, she moved with surprising grace and efficiency. There was no hesitation in her actions. "You know how to build a fire," he noted quietly, stepping closer to the stove to thaw his numb hands. "My father was a rancher, Jedediah, not a banker," Martha said, using a rag to pull the hot skillet from the stove. She portioned the beans and pork onto 2 tin plates. "Before his heart gave out, and before Thaddeus arrived to help, I spent my youth in the cookhouses and the cattle camps. I know how to endure." She handed him a plate. Jedediah took it, sitting heavily at the small wooden table. He took a bite. The food was simple, but she had somehow managed to season it perfectly using the meager wild onions and dried herbs he kept in jars. It was the best meal he'd eaten in a year. Martha sat across from him. She didn't eat with the delicate bird-like bites the women in town affected. She ate heartily, fueling her large body against the cold. "They think you'll die up here," Jedediah said bluntly, his voice low. "Caldwell and your cousin. They think the winter will take you, or you'll run down the mountain and freeze on the trail." "I know exactly what they think," Martha replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden intense fire that mirrored the flames in the stove. "They look at me, and they see a fat, stupid spinster. They see a joke. Thaddeus thinks because he humiliated me, because he banished me, he has won. She leaned forward, her presence filling the room just as much as his did. But Thaddeus is a fool. For the last 10 years, while my father was bedridden, who do you think managed the Higgins ranch? Who negotiated the cattle sales with the Chicago buyers? Who balanced the ledgers and secured the water rights contracts? Jedediah stopped eating, staring at her. You. Me, Martha confirmed. Thaddeus can barely read a ledger, let alone manage a 5,000-acre operation. He thinks stealing the deed is the hard part, but he just inherited a war he doesn't know how to fight. He has the law on his side, Jedediah pointed out. Caldwell owns the courts. Caldwell owns the local courts, Martha corrected smoothly. But the water rights contracts my father and I drafted are registered with the federal land office in Denver, and as long as I am alive, and as long as I am legally married to you, Thaddeus cannot touch the primary accounts. She looked around the tiny, freezing cabin. I just need a place to survive the winter. I need time to write to the federal marshals in the bank in Denver. They sent you here to be my executioner, Jedediah, but instead you are going to be my fortress. Jedediah stared at the woman sitting across from him. The town of Red Oak had wildly underestimated Martha Higgins. She wasn't a victim being led to the slaughter. She was a general, retreating to high ground to plan a devastating counterattack. Jedediah felt a slow, dangerous smile pull at the corners of his mouth. For years, the corrupt town had stepped on him, threatened him, and treated him like an animal. Now, sitting in his cabin was the key to tearing it all down. Well, Mrs. McGraw, Jedediah said, raising his tin coffee cup to her in a silent toast, let it snow. By the first week of December, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had become an impenetrable fortress of white. The snowdrifts outside Jedediah's cabin reached the eaves, and the temperature plunged so low that the trees in the surrounding forest popped and cracked like rifle fire in the dead of night. To the town of Red Oak, nestled miles below in the valley, Martha and Jedediah were as good as dead. But inside the one-room cabin, a different story was unfolding. The hovel had been utterly transformed. Martha had stripped the place of its bachelor squalor. The dirt floor was covered in tightly woven pine boughs that kept the dampness at bay. The rusted cast-iron stove was polished with ash and now perpetually radiating a life-saving heat. She had repurposed empty flour sacks into draft blockers for the door and the single cloudy window. Survival in the high country was not a matter of luck. It was a brutal daily arithmetic. Martha's substantial size, which had been the subject of Red Oak's cruelest jokes, proved to be her greatest asset. Her body retained heat far better than a slender woman's would have, allowing her to move about the freezing cabin and tend to the chores while Jedediah was out hunting. Her immense physical strength, honed from years of wrestling calves and hauling feed sacks on her father's ranch, meant she could chop firewood with the heavy double-bitted axe when Jedediah was delayed. One evening, a massive blizzard blew in, transforming the landscape into a blinding white void. Jedediah had been tracking a bull elk since dawn and had not returned. As the hours ticked by and the wind howled like a chorus of dying animals, Martha felt a cold dread settle in her chest. A man caught in a high-country whiteout had hours, at best, before the cold stopped his heart. Lighting the oil lantern, she wrapped herself in the heavy buffalo robe and tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end to the heavy iron anvil Jedediah kept by the door. She pushed the heavy timber door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Jedediah!" she screamed into the roaring darkness. The sound was swallowed instantly. She waded into the snow, the rope pulling taut behind her. She moved in a sweeping arc, using the lantern to cast a pathetic yellow glow against the driving snow. Her lungs burned with the freezing air. Then, she saw a mound of snow near the woodpile that hadn't been there earlier. It was Jedediah. He had made it back to the clearing but had collapsed from exhaustion and hypothermia just 30 yards from the door. Martha dropped to her knees, digging frantically with her bare hands. Jedediah's face was chalk white, his beard encrusted with solid ice. He was unresponsive. "Get up, you stubborn fool," Martha grunted. She grabbed him beneath his massive arms. He weighed well over 200 pounds, dead weight in the freezing snow. Any other woman would have been powerless to move him. but Martha planted her boots, let out a guttural yell, and heaved. She dragged him inch by inch through the waist-deep snow, following her lifeline back to the door. When she finally pulled him over the threshold, she collapsed, her chest heaving. But there was no time to rest. She bolted the door, dragged him to the cot, and began stripping off his frozen, rigid hides. His skin was dangerously cold to the touch. The fire wasn't enough. Drawing on sheer instinct and ranch country survival, Martha stripped down to her undergarments and climbed into the narrow cot beside him. She wrapped her large, warm body entirely around his freezing frame, pulling the heavy furs over them both. She held him through the night, rubbing his arms and chest, sharing the vital heat her body naturally produced. When Jedediah finally opened his eyes the next morning, the blizzard had passed. He was weak, confused, and acutely aware of the soft, overwhelming warmth pressing against him. He looked up to see Martha's face inches from his own, her glasses resting on the bedside table, her brown eyes watching him carefully. "You died out there," she whispered, her voice rough. "I had to drag you in." Jedediah stared at her. He knew the absolute impossibility of what she had done. He knew how heavy he was, and he knew the ferocity of the storm. He looked at her bare, thick arms, realizing that the very body the town had mocked was the only reason he was drawing breath. "You saved my life, Martha," he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "We are a team, Jedediah," she replied softly, not moving away. "I told you. I am not a burden." He slowly raised a calloused hand and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "No," he said quietly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." By late January, the tension in Red Oak had reached a boiling point. Down in the valley, Thaddeus Higgins was drinking himself into a state of violent paranoia. He had expected Martha's estate to default to him within weeks of the marriage, assuming she had perished in the mountains. But when he marched into the Denver Mercantile Bank with Judge Caldwell's court order, the bank manager had laughed him out of the building. Martha had been thorough. Before she left, she had wired instructions to the federal land office and the bank. "In the event of my marriage, no transfer of the Higgins Ranch deed, nor access to its capital, shall be granted without my physical presence and notarized signature, or the presentation of my certified death certificate signed by a federal marshal." Thaddeus was locked out of the fortune. The local judge's orders meant nothing to a federal bank. Enraged and facing bankruptcy, Thaddeus hired the Slater brothers, Rufus and Cole. They were ruthless, cold-eyed killers who specialized in range wars and breaking strikes. Thaddeus paid them $500 with a simple directive: climb the mountain, find the McGraw cabin, and bring back Martha's signature on a deed transfer. If she refused, they were to bring back her frozen corpse. The Slaters arrived at the Bitter Creek clearing on a bleak gray afternoon. The snow had temporarily stopped, leaving a heavy, terrifying silence in the woods. Inside the cabin, Jedediah was cleaning his Henry rifle. He suddenly paused, his head tilting toward the door. Years of surviving in grizzly territory had given him a sixth sense. "Someone is out there," he whispered, standing up and sliding around into the chamber. Martha immediately stopped mending a shirt. She didn't scream or ask frantic questions. She moved to the far corner, grabbing the heavy double-barreled shotgun Jedediah kept loaded with buckshot. She checked the hammers with a loud metallic clack, clack. "Thaddeus's men?" she asked calmly. "Most likely. Keep away from the window." A heavy fist pounded on the door. "McGraw!" a harsh voice yelled. "Open up! We're here on behalf of Thaddeus Higgins." Jedediah didn't answer. He positioned himself beside the doorframe. "State your business and ride out, or I'll drop you where you stand." "Don't be a fool, trapper," Rufus Slater shouted. "We just need the fat lady to sign a piece of paper. You hand her over, or we burn this shack to the ground with both of you inside it." To punctuate the threat, a bullet ripped through the heavy oak door, splintering the wood inches from Jedediah's head. Jedediah kicked the door open and fired blindly, the Henry rifle roaring in the confined space. He heard a yell of pain as one of the brothers scrambled for cover behind the woodpile. A fierce firefight erupted. The Slaters had repeating rifles and were laying down a heavy suppression fire, turning the cabin's front wall into Swiss cheese. Jedediah returned fire from the doorway, but he was pinned down. Suddenly, Cole Slater broke cover, sprinting toward the blind side of the cabin with a lit torch of pitch pine, intending to set the sod roof ablaze. "Jedediah, he's at the side!" Martha yelled over the deafening gunfire. There was a small, narrow gun port cut into the logs on the side wall, originally meant for fending off bears. Martha shoved the double-barreled shotgun through the gap. She didn't have a clear view, but she could hear the crunch of snow boots against the logs. She pulled both triggers. The explosion shook the entire cabin. The recoil slammed Martha back against the table, bruising her shoulder, but the devastating spray of buckshot blew a hole straight through the timber of the wall and caught Cole Slater directly in the chest. He flew backward into the snowbank, dead before he hit the ground, his torch fizzling out in the snow. "Cole!" Rufus screamed from the woodpile. Panic overtook the surviving brother. He fired a wild volley at the cabin and broke into a run, scrambling toward his tethered horse at the edge of the clearing. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, raising his rifle, his eye dead center on Rufus's back. "Let him go!" Martha commanded, her voice ringing out sharp and authoritative. Jedediah lowered the rifle, looking back at her in surprise. "He'll bring more men." "No, he won't," Martha said, stepping out onto the porch beside him, the smoking shotgun still resting easily in her large hands. "He's going to take a message back to Thaddeus. He's going to tell my cousin that the mountain man didn't kill his brother. The fat old Maid did." Jedediah looked at the dead man in the snow, then up at the formidable, magnificent woman standing beside him. Her chest was heaving, her hair was escaping its bun, and her eyes were burning with a fierce, undeniable power. In that moment, Jedediah McGraw realized he wasn't just harboring a fugitive heiress. He was standing beside a queen of the high country, and he was hopelessly, irreversibly in love with her. February brought the first agonizingly slow signs of a thaw. The days grew slightly longer, and the icicles hanging from the cabin roof began to drip in the afternoon sun. The attack by the Slater brothers had fundamentally shifted the dynamic inside the cabin. The invisible wall of formality between Jedediah and Martha had shattered. They no longer slept in separate corners of the room. At night, they lay together under the buffalo robes, talking for hours in the dark. Martha spoke of her father, of the sprawling plains, and of her dreams of building a town where the law wasn't bought and sold by men like Judge Caldwell. Jedediah spoke of his past, of the heartbreaking loss of his younger brother in a mining collapse years ago, which had driven him to seek the solitary peace of the mountains. They had become husband and wife in every true sense of the word. The marriage, born of cruelty and coercion, had forged a bond of unbreakable steel. But the war was far from over. "Thaddeus won't stop," Martha said one evening, sitting at the table with a stack of paper and a bottle of ink. "Rufus surviving will keep them at bay for a while out of fear, but desperation makes men stupid. If Thaddeus goes bankrupt, he'll raise a posse of 20 men and claim we murdered his employee." "We need to strike first," Jedediah agreed, sharpening his hunting knife. "But we can't go down to Red Oak. Dooley and his deputies will shoot me on sight and drag you to Caldwell." "We aren't going to Red Oak," Martha said, a sharp smile playing on her lips. She began writing rapidly. She drafted 3 distinct documents. Document 1. A detailed notarized affidavit exposing Judge Caldwell's extortion, land theft, and complicity in attempted murder. Document 2. A formal request for a federal audit of the Higgins estate, naming Thaddeus Higgins for embezzlement. Document 3. A letter addressed to U.S. Marshal Thomas H. Rucker, stationed in the booming silver town of Leadville, 40 miles over the treacherous mountain pass. Leadville, Jedediah mused, looking at the letters. It's a brutal trek this time of year. The snow in the high passes is still chest deep. A horse can't make it. It has to be on snowshoes. "Can you do it?" Martha asked, looking at him with absolute trust. "I can," Jedediah said, "but it means leaving you here alone for at least 5 days. If Thaddeus comes back, I have the shotgun, Jedediah, and I have the high ground," Martha said fiercely. I survived Red Oak's cruelty for 32 years. I can survive 5 days in my own home. The next morning, Jedediah packed his heavy pack with dried meat, a tin of coffee, and Martha's letters wrapped securely in oilcloth. He strapped his handmade ashwood snowshoes to his boots. Martha stood at the door, her heavy shawl wrapped tightly around her. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. "Deliver the letters to Marshal Rucker personally," she instructed. "Do not trust the local postmaster in Leadville." "I will," Jedediah said. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the upcoming journey and the danger of leaving her hanging heavy on his soul. He reached out, taking her face in his large, scarred hands. "When this is over," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble, "when we take back your ranch and clear out that rotten town?" "What then, Martha? Do you go back to your manor and leave the mountain man behind?" Martha stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She wrapped her arms around his thick neck, her sheer physical presence matching his own, and pulled him down into a deep, desperate kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and a wild, untamed love. When she pulled back, she looked him dead in the eye. "Red Oak is my land, Jedediah, but this cabin is my home, and you are my husband. We fight this war together, and we live our lives together. Now go. Ride like the devil is on your heels." Jedediah grinned, a feral, joyous expression. He turned and plunged into the deep snow, heading up toward the impossible peaks of the pass. For 5 days, Martha waited. She chopped wood. She kept the fire burning. She sat by the window with the Henry rifle across her lap, watching the tree line for any sign of Thaddeus's men. The isolation was maddening, the silence absolute. She found herself sleeping in Jedediah's heavy coat, seeking the lingering scent of pine and leather that brought her comfort. On the afternoon of the 6th day, the silence of the mountain was broken by the sharp, unmistakable sound of a bugle call echoing up from the valley below. Martha rushed to the window. Riding up the trail, carving a path through the melting snowdrifts, was not a posse of local thugs. It was a column of 15 armed men wearing the dark blue coats and wide-brimmed hats of the United States Federal Marshals. Leading the column on a massive black draft horse was Marshal Thomas Rucker, and riding right beside him, looking exhausted but fiercely triumphant, was Jedediah McGraw. Martha threw open the heavy timber door, stepping out onto the porch. The sun hit her face, warm and bright. The winter siege was over. The counterattack had officially begun. The heavy timber door swung open, and Martha stepped out onto the frost-heaved planks of the cabin's porch. The afternoon sun, bright and blinding against the endless white of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, cast long shadows across the clearing. The column of federal marshals brought their horses to a halt, the steam rising from the massive animals in thick, rhythmic clouds. Marshal Thomas Rucker dismounted. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving granite as the peaks themselves. Tall, silver-haired, with a heavy walrus mustache and eyes the color of slate. He wore a heavy wool duster over his dark blue uniform, a gleaming silver star pinned to his chest. Behind him, Jedediah slid down from his own exhausted mount, his chest heaving, his beard coated in frost, but his eyes locked immediately onto Martha. Jedediah didn't wait for introductions. He waded through the knee-deep snow, took the porch steps in a single stride, and wrapped his massive arms around his wife. He buried his face in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and the sweet plain soap she used. "I told you I'd be back," he rumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. Martha closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his broad chest. Her hands, calloused and strong, gripped his thick hide coat. "You were gone a day longer than I calculated, Jedediah McGraw. I was beginning to think you got lost." "Just had to do some convincing," Jedediah replied, pulling back to look at her, a fierce pride in his eyes. Marshal Rucker stepped up to the porch, touching the brim of his hat. He looked at Martha, taking in her substantial frame, her steady brown eyes, and the sheer, unyielding authority she radiated. He had read her letters. He had seen the impeccable penmanship and the brilliant legal trap she had laid out on paper. He had expected an educated woman, perhaps, but not this towering force of nature who looked entirely at home in the harshest wilderness in the territory. "Mrs. McGraw, I presume," Rucker said, his voice carrying the deep timbre of a man accustomed to giving orders in chaotic situations. "I am United States Marshal Thomas Rucker. Your husband here nearly froze to death breaking trail to Leadville to deliver your parcel. And you rode through chest-deep snow to answer it, Marshal. For that, you have my profound gratitude," Martha said, her voice steady and rich. "Please, bring your men inside. It is tight quarters, but there is coffee on the stove, and I have elk stew simmering. You must be half frozen." Over the next 2 hours, the small cabin was packed shoulder to shoulder with armed federal lawmen. While the men ate and thawed their frozen extremities, Rucker sat at the scarred wooden table with Martha and Jedediah. Rucker laid out the documents Jedediah had carried over the pass. "I have to admit, Mrs. McGraw," Rucker said, wiping a drop of stew from his mustache, "when your husband first stumbled into my office, I thought he was a madman. But these affidavits, you have documented a decade of Judge Caldwell's financial extortion. You have the exact dates, the ledger entries, and the land parcels he forced into foreclosure to benefit Thaddeus Higgins." "My father kept meticulous records," Martha explained, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "When he fell ill, I took over the bookkeeping. I saw the money Thaddeus was siphoning. I saw the bribes paid to Sheriff Dooley and Judge Caldwell. I knew if I simply went to the territorial governor, the paperwork would disappear. I needed a federal authority. The water rights my father secured crossed territorial lines into federal jurisdiction. That makes Thaddeus's theft a federal crime." Rucker nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. "Wire fraud, extortion, violation of the Homestead Act, and, thanks to the Slater brothers, attempted murder." Rucker gestured toward the frozen corpse of Cole Slater, which his men had found half buried in a snowdrift outside. "Your husband mentioned you were the one who pulled the trigger on that particular problem. He was trying to burn my house down with my husband and me inside," Martha said, her tone devoid of apology or hesitation. "I defended my home." "And you did it cleanly," Rucker said, his respect for her visibly deepening. He tapped the paperwork. "Down in Red Oak, Thaddeus and Caldwell are moving forward. According to a telegraph I intercepted before we rode out, Caldwell is preparing to officially declare you deceased by misadventure. They are planning to transfer the entirety of the Higgins estate to Thaddeus tomorrow morning at the town hall. They think they've won." Jedediah leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the table. The knuckles were white. "Then we ride down at first light. We hit the town before they can sign the ink on that theft." "No," Martha said softly, looking at the map Rucker had laid out. "We don't just hit the town, Jedediah. We rip it out by the roots. Caldwell has 20 deputies on his payroll. Thaddeus likely has hired more gunmen since Rufus Slater rode back with the news of his brother's death. If we just ride in, there will be a bloodbath in the streets, and innocent people will be caught in the crossfire." "What do you suggest, Mrs. McGraw?" Rucker asked, leaning back in his chair. "We do not ride in as an invading army," Martha said, her eyes flashing with a tactical brilliance that left the hardened lawman in awe. "We ride in as a ghost. They believe I am dead. They are holding a public council to finalize the theft. We let them gather everyone, the deputies, the judge, Thaddeus, and the townsfolk. We let them lock themselves inside the town hall. And then we shut the trap." The marshals exchanged glances. They were men of action, used to kicking down doors, but the quiet, devastating logic of the woman before them was undeniable. "First light," Rucker commanded his men. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we take a town." The descent down the mountain the next morning was a grueling, treacherous affair. The thaw had made the snow heavy and wet, and the horses slipped dangerously on the icy rocks beneath the slush. Jedediah rode point, navigating the narrow switchbacks with the instinct of a man who knew every stone and pine tree on the mountain. Martha rode beside Rucker on a sturdy gray mare Jedediah had kept, pastured lower down the mountain. She wore her thick wool shawl and her heavy winter skirts. She didn't look like a society lady, nor did she look like the broken, humiliated spinster the town had banished 5 months ago. Her face was tanned from the high-altitude sun, her posture was straight as a plumb line, and there was a terrifying, beautiful calm about her. As they dropped below the timberline, the snow gave way to the brown, muddy plains of the valley. In the distance, the smoke from the chimneys of red oak rose into the crisp blue sky. Jedediah pulled his horse alongside Martha's. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand covering hers on the reins. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "They're going to look at you. They're going to stare, just like they did at the wedding." Martha looked at the town that had tormented her for her entire life. She thought of the cruel whispers about her weight, the jokes about her appearance, the sheer, unadulterated greed that had driven them to exile her to a freezing hovel. She turned her gaze to Jedediah. "Let them stare, my love, because today I am not a joke. I am the reckoning." The Red Oak Town Hall was packed tighter than a cattle car in July. Every wooden bench was filled. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigars, unwashed bodies, and the palpable electricity of greed. At the front of the room, elevated on a wooden dais, sat Judge Hiram Caldwell. He wore his finest black robes, looking down his rat-like nose at the assembly. Beside him, leaning casually against the judge's heavy oak desk, was Thaddeus Higgins. Thaddeus was dressed in a tailored silk suit purchased on credit, a smug, oily smile plastered across his face. Sheriff Dooley and 10 of his deputies stood around the perimeter of the room, their hands resting lazily on the butts of their revolvers. They were the muscle, ensuring the town's silent compliance. "Order! Order in the hall," Judge Caldwell announced, banging a wooden gavel against a block. The murmurs of the crowd died down. "We are gathered here today to conclude the tragic, though legally necessary business of the Higgins estate," Caldwell began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "It has been 5 months since Martha Higgins, legally wed to the mountain trapper Jedediah McGraw, departed into the high country. Despite the best efforts of search parties..." A quiet scoff rippled through the back of the room. Everyone knew no search party had ever been sent. "Neither hide nor hair of the couple has been found," Caldwell continued smoothly. "Given the brutal nature of the winter we have just endured, it is the finding of this court that Martha Higgins McGraw perished in the wilderness. Due to her failure to maintain the estate and her tragic demise, the entirety of the Higgins ranch, its cattle, its mineral rights, and its water deeds revert to her nearest living blood relative, Mr. Thaddeus Higgins." Thaddeus stepped forward, puffing his chest out. "I just want to say, I will manage my late uncle's land with the utmost respect. This town relies on that water, and as the new head of the Higgins family, I promise a new era of prosperity for Red Oak." "If you will just sign the transfer, Thaddeus," Caldwell said, dipping a feather pen into an inkwell and extending it outward. Thaddeus reached for the pen. His fingers were millimeters from the wood when the heavy double doors at the back of the town hall exploded inward with a deafening crash. The heavy iron hinges shattered, the wood splintering violently as they were kicked open from the outside. The townsfolk screamed and scrambled out of the center aisle. Standing in the doorway, blocking the blinding afternoon sun, was a silhouette of absolute terror to the men at the front of the room. It was Jedediah McGraw. He was clad in his heavy grizzly hides, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire threshold. He carried a Henry repeating rifle casually in his right hand. But it was not Jedediah who commanded the room. From behind the mountain, man stepped Martha. She walked into the town hall with the slow, deliberate stride of a reigning monarch entering a conquered province. Her boots echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not look at the terrified townsfolk who pressed themselves against the walls. Her eyes, burning with a cold brown fire, were locked dead on Thaddeus. "Put the pen down, Thaddeus," Martha's voice rang out, clear, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. "The ink belongs to me." The color drained entirely from Thaddeus's face. He staggered backward, knocking the inkwell over. The black liquid spilled across the fraudulent deeds. "Martha, you're dead." "I am remarkably resilient for a corpse, cousin," she replied, continuing her steady march down the center aisle, Jedediah, a silent towering shadow at her shoulder. Judge Caldwell leaped to his feet, his gavel clattering to the floor. "Sheriff Dooley, arrest that man! McGraw is a wanted poacher. Arrest them both!" Dooley drew his revolver, stepping into the aisle to block their path. "Hold it right there, McGraw. You're trespassing, and the lady is clinically insane if she thinks she's walking out of here." Before Dooley could even cock the hammer, the shattered doorway behind Martha filled with dark blue wool and gleaming silver stars. 15 United States federal marshals filed into the room, their Winchester rifles raised and leveled at the deputies lining the walls. Marshal Thomas Rucker stepped in last, the spurs on his boots jingling in the sudden horrifying silence that had overtaken the hall. "Drop the iron, local!" Rucker barked at Dooley, his voice cracking like a bullwhip. "Or my men will turn you into a sieve." Dooley hesitated. That split second of indecision was all Jedediah needed. With terrifying speed for a man of his size, Jedediah lunged forward. He closed the 5-foot gap in a heartbeat, his massive hand clamping around Dooley's wrist. He squeezed. A sickening crunch echoed through the hall, and Dooley screamed, dropping the revolver. Jedediah shoved the sheriff backward with such force that Dooley flew over the front row of pews, crashing into a pile of splintered wood and groaning townsfolk. "Nobody else touch a weapon," Rucker commanded, striding down the aisle to stand beside Martha. "I am Federal Marshal Thomas Rucker. Every deputy in this room is hereby disarmed and detained under the authority of the United States Justice Department." The deputies, looking at the hardened federal lawmen aiming at their chests, wisely unbuckled their gun belts and let them drop to the floor. Martha finally reached the dais. She looked up at Judge Caldwell, who was sweating profusely, his rat-like face twitching with panic. "Martha, my dear," Caldwell stammered, holding up his hands, "this is a terrible misunderstanding. We truly thought you had perished. We were only trying to preserve your father's legacy." "You were trying to steal my water rights, Hiram," Martha said, not raising her voice, though it carried to every corner of the dead-silent hall. "You conspired with my cousin to force a legal marriage under threat of the gallows to a man you believed would either kill me or let the winner do the job. You issued fraudulent warrants. You seized property illegally." Martha reached inside her heavy shawl and pulled out the thick stack of ledgers and the affidavits Marshal Rucker had reviewed. She slammed them down onto the judge's desk, right on top of the spilled ink. "These are the financial records of this town for the last 10 years, Martha announced to the entire room. She turned to face the townsfolk, the people who had mocked her, who had laughed as she walked down the aisle to what they believed was her doom. "Judge Caldwell has been extorting the Lower Valley ranchers," Martha declared, her voice ringing with unquestionable authority. "He has been inflating property taxes on those who opposed him and foreclosing on lands to sell them back to Thaddeus Higgins at a fraction of the cost. He has stolen from every family in this room." A shocked, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. The townsfolk looked at Caldwell, then back to the imposing, powerful woman who was laying out their salvation. "Oh, you have no jurisdiction to make such accusations!" Caldwell shrieked, his composure shattering. "She doesn't," Marshal Rucker interrupted, stepping up to the dais. "But I do. Hiram Caldwell, you are under federal arrest for extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Thaddeus Higgins, you are under arrest for the same, along with the attempted murder of a federal witness." Thaddeus let out a sound like a trapped rat. Desperation took over. He reached into his tailored coat and pulled out a hidden silver-plated derringer, aiming it frantically at Martha's chest. "I won't let a fat sow take my town," Thaddeus screamed. He never got to pull the trigger. Jedediah moved like a striking grizzly. He vaulted onto the dais, his massive fist swinging in a brutal, crushing arc. The blow connected squarely with Thaddeus's jaw. The sound was like a heavy branch snapping in a quiet forest. Thaddeus was lifted completely off his feet, spinning in the air before crashing into the chalkboard behind the judge's desk, out cold before he hit the ground. Jedediah stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and protective. He looked down at Thaddeus, then turned his gaze on Caldwell, daring the judge to move a single muscle. Caldwell slumped into his chair, raising his hands in absolute surrender. Martha didn't flinch. She hadn't even taken a step back. She simply adjusted her glasses, looking at the broken men who had tried to ruin her. "Marshal Rucker," Martha said calmly, brushing a speck of dust from her sleeve. "Get this trash out of my town hall." The trials were held in Denver, far from the corrupted influence of Red Oak's local politics. With Martha's meticulous ledgers, her devastating testimony, and Marshal Rucker's federal backing, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Hiram Caldwell was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. Thaddeus Higgins, for his part in hiring the Slater brothers in his attempted assassination in the town hall, was sentenced to 30 years of hard labor. Sheriff Dooley and his most corrupt deputies were stripped of their badges and imprisoned for extortion. In the span of a month, the toxic hierarchy that had choked Red Oak for a decade was entirely eradicated. And into that vacuum stepped Martha McGraw. When Martha and Jedediah returned to Red Oak from Denver, the atmosphere in the town had fundamentally shifted. The cruelty and the mockery were gone, replaced by a profound, almost fearful respect. The townsfolk had realized that the woman they had dismissed as a fat spinster possessed an intellect and a ruthlessness that dwarfed the men they had feared. Martha did not seek petty revenge against the townsfolk who had laughed at her wedding. Instead, she sought absolute control. She reopened the Higgins Ranch, not as a closed monopoly, but as an empire. She renegotiated the water rights, offering fair prices to the Lower Valley ranchers who had been bled dry by Caldwell. She fired the corrupt bank manager and installed an honest accountant she brought in from Denver. Within a year, Red Oak was experiencing an economic boom it hadn't seen since the gold rush days. But the most profound change was not in the town. It was in the lives of Martha and Jedediah. Martha had absolutely no desire to live in the cavernous, lonely manor of her late father down in the valley. It held too many memories of her isolation and her cousin's cruelty. Likewise, Jedediah's tiny one-room trapping cabin on the mountain, while sacred to them as the place they fell in love, was too small for the life they were building. So they built something entirely new. Halfway up the mountain, nestled on a massive plateau that overlooked the sprawling valley of Red Oak below, they constructed the new McGraw estate. It was a masterpiece of frontier architecture, a sprawling lodge built from massive hand-hewn spruce logs and riverstone. It had wide verandas that wrapped around the structure, massive stone fireplaces that could heat the entire house during the deepest winter, and a library filled with leather-bound books where Martha managed her empire. It was a fortress that bridged their two worlds. It sat above the town, untouchable and supreme, yet deeply connected to the wild, untamed nature of the high country. 2 years after the chaotic day in the town hall, a crisp autumn wind blew across the plateau. The aspen trees had turned a brilliant fiery gold, and the air smelled of pine and impending snow. Martha sat in a heavy rocking chair on the sweeping wooden veranda of the lodge. She was dressed not in the restrictive mourning black of her past, but in a rich, warm brown skirt and a beautifully embroidered linen blouse. She looked out over the valley, watching the tiny, distant specks of Higgins cattle moving across the plains. The heavy wooden door opened behind her, and heavy, familiar boots stepped onto the porch. Jedediah walked out, carrying 2 steaming tin mugs of coffee. He was still a massive, imposing man, but his beard was neatly trimmed, and the wild, hunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, anchoring peace. He handed her a mug and leaned against the wooden railing beside her chair. "Foreman says the lower herd is moved to the winter pastures," Jedediah reported, his deep voice rumbling pleasantly in the quiet air. "And the new schoolhouse down in town is getting its roof today, paid for in full, just like you ordered." "Good," Martha said, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "An educated town is far less likely to elect another idiot like Caldwell." Jedediah chuckled, the sound rich and warm. He looked down at his wife. She was still a woman of immense size, a woman who defied every delicate, fragile expectation of the era. But to Jedediah, she was the most breathtaking creature the frontier had ever produced. She had taken a broken, solitary mountain man and a town rotting from the inside, and she had forged an empire out of sheer will. Just then, the screen door banged open again. A sturdy, heavy-set toddler with a shock of thick dark hair and his father's fierce eyes came tumbling out onto the porch. Little Josiah McGraw let out a joyous shriek, barreling forward on unsteady legs. Jedediah scooped the boy up with one massive arm, tossing him gently into the air before catching him against his broad chest. The boy giggled wildly, grabbing a fistful of his father's beard. Martha watched them, a profound, overwhelming love swelling in her chest. She thought back to the day she had stood in the church, surrounded by mocking laughter, forced to marry a wild savage to save her life. They had intended to bury her. They had intended to break her under the weight of the mountain. She stood up, her presence as commanding and magnificent as the peaks that surrounded them. She stepped over to her husband, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder as they looked out over their land. They hadn't just survived the mountain, they had conquered it. And the legend of the fierce trapper and his brilliant, unbreakable bride would echo through the valleys of red oak long after the snows had melted and the old corrupt men had turned to dust. What a journey! From a cruel, forced wedding meant to destroy her, Martha Higgins rose up alongside the wild mountain man to build an empire and bring a corrupt town to its knees. If you love this incredible true tale of frontier justice, survival, and unbreakable romance, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us bring more hidden histories of the Wild West to light. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant underdog story. And leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Martha's revenge? Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. See you on the next trail.